Hello and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Parker, Bridgestone Mobility Solutions EV Specialist and Corporate Sales Manager for Webfleet.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, Richard. Great to see you again.
And you?
I hope you're ready for a lively discussion this morning.
Oh, always. It's never anything other but with you.
Right. Okay. We're gonna keep this nice and strategic today, Richard. And I'd like to really dive into some of the strategic factors that are driving change within fleets. What would you say is the biggest catalyst for fleet decarbonisation over the coming months?
So, whilst everyone knows that we've got the headline figures from the central government, I think one of the things that we are starting to see is a number of local authorities now enacting the clean air zones that they've got. You know, Sheffield and Newcastle, you know, just the recent ones. And I was up at Christmas and I noticed Bradford's gone as well. So, you know, we're starting to see, and that's over quite a large area, is Bradford as well. So, you know, the scope of that is definitely going to be having an impact on fleets as they're entering and the thought process about how they operate in those areas. But I do think the other thing that we're starting to see leveraged in the conversations that I'm having is all around perhaps the Scope 3 emissions and the legislation that was brought in April of last year, the task force for climate disclosure, which is affecting the largest companies. But the impact we're starting to now see filter down through the organizations that are suppliers, both upstream and downstream to those organizations. So we're starting to see that be a catalyst for contractual purposes, if you like, as well. That's starting to occur.
Okay, so it's definitely regulation and legislation that is having that kind of acting externally on these fleets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just feels like the things that we talked about 2 years ago that seemed so far off in some of those timelines are drawing more and more close, and people's focus on those, even with the constraints and the financial and operational headwinds that we've got today, are you know, a requirement of sustaining that business. So for example, we know of like a couple of organizations where, you know, they're relatively small, but the contracts to some of those larger suppliers are a significant part of their business, and they're being asked and challenged to prove their carbon position as a result of fulfilling that contract to that upward supply chain. And so their businesses are all of a sudden potentially going to be at risk because of the fulfillment of these contractual obligations. So that's the sort of shift in conversation that we're starting to see happen now.
Okay, all right. So help me understand this a bit, Richard, because it's certainly a hot topic and I'm hearing it all the time. But can you just define for me, help me understand what Scope 3 emissions is and what that means for fleets and how they can prepare for it?
And I'm no expert in scopes, you know, in all the scope by any stretch. But as I understand it, Scope 3 emissions are an organization's carbon contribution in its supply chain in the context of what we're talking about today, both upstream and downstream. So there are some figures banded around in some organizations that are affected under this reporting criteria, that up to 80% of their emissions as an organization comes from this Scope 3 fulfillment in their supply chains upstream and downstream, which is why the focus is starting to build. So what is the impact? So as part of the reporting requirements under Scope 3, these organizations have to demonstrate not only an understanding of what the carbon footprint is for that supply chain upstream and downstream, but also what are the action plans to mitigate and reduce those footprints. Now, of course, that supply chain are potentially much smaller organizations who perhaps aren't as far forward in their decarbonisation journey. And so actually to suddenly be in a position where they're having to understand how to calculate the carbon footprint, how to get the information and how to develop plans to reduce that carbon footprint is proving to be quite challenging, I think, for them. It's, you know, it's an indirect consequence of this larger piece of legislation.
I get it, and it is a little bit mind-blowing. So this is legislation that at the moment is focusing on larger organisations having to report their scope.
Correct. Yeah.
Emissions. So there's no targets as such at the moment. There's no. I mean, obviously, we've got the 2050 net zero, and some businesses will have declared that they're going to be net zero by 2030. But fundamentally, we're in the discovery phase of this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I do think that one of the things that equally is a factor in this, as well as the legislation, a lot of those larger organisations are setting mandates on timescales for decarbonisation, you know, and publicly going to market with their ESG policies, their CSR policies, and that is having to be delivered by others in their organisations, and it's filtering out. And it's where do you look to you know, to get rid of that carbon footprint? Okay,
I understand. So this is. If you're a smaller fleet, and like you say, whether you're upstream or downstream of this company, whilst you're not under internal pressure to decarbonise, you really need to be looking around and speaking to your customers and speaking to your own suppliers to understand what this picture is, because I think what you've alluded to is, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point in the future, in the near future, procurement processes are going to start to become defined by emissions. And this could be the difference between winning and losing a contract.
So I won't name any organisation clearly, but I have had a number of conversations the last 4 months, and the roles with specific people in those organisations, you know, linked to procurement, and there will be a series of actions now whereby supply chains will be looked at, and it will be fulfilment of decarbonisation priorities that are a significant part of resecuring pieces of business. And within that, because of the level of reporting that is now required for these organisations, there'll also potentially be a reduction in the number of suppliers they're prepared to work with, because of course there'll be an inward bound series of information that they're having to manage now that they've never had to manage before. So will it potentially lead to a cull in that supply chain for people who can't fulfill easily the requirements?
It's too difficult to put that reporting and tracking in place for some of these organizations.
If you have 10,000 suppliers, you know, at what level, you know, how much information can you then take in? So I do think this landscape it's two-sided. There's difficulties for those that require for reporting, but the difficulty for the smaller organizations finding their feet quickly on something they probably yet haven't really started to look at in some instances.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. You know, is this being talked about enough? Is it being understood to the level it should be? And are some of our fleets who engage with GreenFleet regularly, you know, do they really understand the significance of this?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, I think that's one challenge. But I think for me as well, the other challenge is if they are attending GreenFleet events, they're already curious. And for me, I also try and look, how do we and where do we speak about these things for those that aren't yet curious, for those that are a little bit dismissive of what's coming, because they're some of the organizations and potentially our customers, you know, as Webfleet, that could potentially get hit hard, you know. So actually, you know, I'm always thinking about how do we get to the people who don't yet engage, and we bring them to the table to at least start understanding what is needed in the coming years.
Yeah,
I've heard too many times there's just not the right vehicle, and it's a very quick and easy answer to give. But there's plenty that can be done, even notwithstanding availability and capability of vehicles in the marketplace.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think that the current cost pressures that we've really seen coming to play in the last 12, 18 months are going to further delay decarbonisation of transport fleets?
Do I think that they will delay the onboarding of electric vehicles? Yes. But decarbonisation isn't always about just the EV, you know, switching to EV. I know we might talk about that later, but I do think, and if you look at the SMMT figures that have come out this week for commercial vehicles, it's certainly the share of battery electric vehicles in the overall sales has dropped from 7.1 to 4.9% for the year to date.
Interesting. Right. Okay.
So it does suggest that there is delay and businesses are reconsidering. We know the factors, the price of vehicles constantly going up and the lack of surety at the price of order, the lead times on vehicles and the
electricity costs.
Exactly. So it's no surprise that probably people who had very clear plans are going back because the other financial and fiscal pressures they've got from resource and inflationary issues is clearly going to get them to review what that is. And actually, there is an inherent risk that needs to be managed with switching and changing the way that your business operates and everything else like that. And at a time when I guess risks, there's a lot of risks. If you're going to change a vehicle and the previous risks, probably at this time you're just going to keep it as a diesel. And that's the challenge, because it's actually it's a known risk. It's understood. You've run it before. It's easy, and you can park that one if you like,
and it ticks
and deal with the others.
And it ticks a short-term box in terms of cost saving and those things. And the downside, of course, is that a fleet would typically keep a vehicle for, let's say, between 3 and 5 years. I know sometimes it's longer. But so you're potentially banking that win today, but in 18 months' time, when the Scope 3 emission pressure is really ramping up, you may regret having diesels lingering on your fleet for another.
I agree. But I think some people look at it and go, still, well, it's still one change cycle away. And actually, those are, invariably people who don't understand what's needed from a power and an energy perspective, and if you're thinking about waiting until 2027, 4 years from now to start that journey, for me, that's, you're going to be in a whole heap of trouble if you're just kicking the can a little bit. So that's why I keep trying to talk to people about.
I was going to say, particularly if you are a supplier to one of these larger organisations that has a more pressing target than perhaps
Correct.
Your own internal. Okay, so you alluded to this a minute ago, Richard, but we've said that at the moment the Scope 3 emissions is in the discovery phase, and it's all about being able to gather and access that data and present it in a format. Is this where telematics comes into play? How is Webfleet supporting this activity?
Okay. So and it's something I've talked about for 18 months, and I know we've talked about with you. Look, the first stage of that you can do that is in the total control of any organization is to decarbonize what they've already got. Okay, and that's clearly is going to be data that provides the insight to allow you to know what the specific business opportunities are. But it comes back to a simple premise: every MPG or mile you take out of the business, MPG you increase or mile you take out of your operation will improve your carbon footprint. And so, and then you starting with that premise, then breaking it down into, where are our vehicles going? Do they need to do that trip? Are they carrying the payload, too much payload? Could we take weight out of the vehicles? Are the tires in front? And then you get to the telematics, and it's how are our drivers behaving? Are they flooring it? Are they idling? What fuel is being wasted? These are all really simple and well-trodden data insights that exist from telematics already. Now's the time probably to start revisiting how those are managed within an organization, and decarbonizing what's already there, because that is that movement towards all this Scope 3 and showing that you understand your baseline and that you have action plans to reduce. that impact on a monthly, annual basis.
Yeah, and you can't do any of those great things if you haven't benchmarked what your fleet is currently doing.
Correct. You need accurate information, because if you're going to ask, at the end of the day, we have to think about as well, who affects this change. And in the most cases of telematics, it's the driver, right? It's not the fleet manager, the driver who's the one who's got his right foot on the pedal. So how do you influence that driver to behave in a way that is congruent with reducing your carbon footprint? And that's, about talking to them, and it's about making it simple and giving them something they can understand to affect that behavior. But at every point, the information you deliver has to be credible and accurate. And that comes from the telematics. It can't be vague and ambiguous.
So it's almost the first step on the ladder, isn't it? If you haven't got that, then you can't start reducing the carbon in your fleet. Or
no, you can't.
If you're not measuring it, you don't know if
you're not measuring it. And it's easy to be anecdotal with fleets. It used to be the way, our fleet does 20,000 miles a year every year for 4 years. Well, actually, in this transition that we have to go through, each vehicle has to be assessed here and now today on its own merits individually, and that requires specific information and to understand where it's going, how it's getting there, where it's stopping, how long it's stopping for. You need accurate data and insight to be able to make those decisions from that.
So Richard, thank you very much. We've gone from big strategic global right down to what's that particular vehicle doing and when did he have his lunch break, which is the truth of all of this, isn't it? Building that picture up. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Of course, thank you to Webfleet for joining GreenFleet Talks. And finally, thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope to speak to you again soon.